October 30th, 2018, inside the high-security walls of USP Hazelton in West Virginia, an 89-year-old man was wheeled into the general population. His hair was white, his body frail, but his name still carried weight. Within hours of arriving, 3 inmates cornered him in a cell. They beat him with a padlock stuffed inside a sock, hitting him so hard his eyes were damn near gouged out of his skull. When guards found him the next morning, James Whitey Bulger was dead, wrapped in a blanket like garbage, his face beaten so bad you couldn't even recognize him. For a man who terrorized Boston for decades, murdered at least 19 people, and lived as a fugitive for 16 years, this was how it ended. Brutal, bloody, and in the exact kind of violence he dealt out his entire life. But the real question ain't how Whitey died, it's how he got away with it for so long. How does a stone-cold killer operate freely while the FBI looks the other way? How does a crime boss build an empire with federal agents running interference? That story don't start in a prison cell. It starts in the projects of South Boston, where loyalty was law and the code was simple. Never snitch, never fold, and never trust nobody outside your own. James Joseph Bulger Jr. came into the world on September 3rd, 1929, right as the Great Depression was crushing working families across America. His parents, James Sr. and Jane Bulger, were Irish Catholics trying to survive in Dorchester, Massachusetts, raising 6 kids on whatever scraps they could find. His father worked the docks as a longshoreman and union laborer, breaking his back for pennies, until an industrial accident took his arm and damn near took his livelihood with it. After that, money got tight real quick. The kind of tight where you go to bed hungry and wake up the same way. In 1938, when Whitey was 8, the family moved into the old Harbor Village housing projects in South Boston, a neighborhood everybody called Southie. It wasn't just a place, it was a whole culture. Southie was Irish, Catholic, working class, and fiercely loyal to its own. The unwritten rules were carved into every street corner. You protect your block, you never talk to cops, and outsiders don't last long. These weren't suggestions. This was survival. This was the air you breathed. Whitey got his nickname because of his platinum blonde hair, almost white under the sun. He hated being called Whitey, always preferred Jim or Jimmy, but the streets named you, not the other way around. Even as a kid, he had that look in his eyes, the kind that said he wasn't someone you wanted to test. His younger brother, William Billy Bulger, was different though. Billy was smart, disciplined, stayed in the books, and eventually became one of the most powerful politicians in Massachusetts. But Whitey was built for the block. By the time he was a teenager, Whitey was deep in the streets. He ran with a local gang called the Shamrocks, pulling petty thefts, getting into fights, and learning how to hustle. At just 14 years old, in 1943, he caught his first arrest for larceny. It was the start of a record that would stretch across decades. Juvenile detention didn't scare him straight. If anything, it made him sharper. He learned how to move smarter, how to avoid getting caught, and how to use fear as a weapon. Over the next few years, Whitey racked up charges: forgery, assault and battery, armed robbery. The system kept trying to fix him, but Whitey wasn't broken. He was exactly what Southie made him. In 1948, maybe looking for discipline or just trying to dodge more trouble, he joined the United States Air Force. He earned his high school diploma while enlisted and trained as a mechanic, but the military couldn't tame him either. He assaulted another airman, went AWOL more than once, and spent time in the stockade. Still, somehow, he walked away with an honorable discharge in 1952. When Whitey came back to Boston, he didn't slow down. He took day jobs, construction, janitorial work, anything that paid, but at night he was back in the game, running bookmaking operations and loan sharking. The hustle never stopped. In 1956, the feds caught up with him. He got hit with federal charges for bank robbery and hijacking trucks full of goods. This time, the hammer came down hard. 20 years in federal prison. But prison didn't break Whitey Bulger. It made him something worse. During his time locked up, Whitey volunteered for something most men wouldn't touch: a CIA-funded program testing LSD and other hallucinogenic drugs on inmates. The program, later exposed as part of the notorious MK Ultra experiments, was the government's attempt to explore mind control and chemical interrogation techniques. Whitey took doses of LSD over 50 times in exchange for reduced time on his sentence. What those experiments did to his mind, nobody knows for sure. But the man who came out wasn't the same man who went in. something shifted, something cold settled in. Whitey did time in some of the most notorious prisons in America: Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, Leavenworth, and 3 years in Alcatraz, the island fortress where America sent its most dangerous criminals. Being at Alcatraz gave him a reputation before he ever touched the streets again. Inmates respected him, guards remembered him. And when he finally walked out in 1965 after serving 9 years, he was 36 years old, hardened by concrete and bars, and ready to take what he thought the world owed him. Back in Southie, things had changed, but the game was still the same. Whitey linked up with Donald Killeen, the leader of a South Boston gang that controlled the neighborhood's illegal rackets. The Killeens were locked in a bloody war with a rival crew called the Mullins, and bodies were starting to pile up. Whitey became Killeen's enforcer, the muscle behind the operation, the guy you called when someone needed to disappear. But Whitey wasn't content being anyone's hired gun. He was watching, learning, waiting, and when the opportunity came to flip the board, he took it without hesitation. In the early 1970s, Whitey saw that the gang war was tearing Southie apart, block by block, body by body. So he made a move that would define the rest of his life. He reached out to the Mullins and helped broker a truce, but in doing so, he also positioned himself as the new power in the neighborhood. Donald Killeen ended up dead, shot outside his home in 1972. While some dispute Whitey's direct involvement, the result was clear. Whitey walked away with more power than he had before. Around the same time, Whitey caught the attention of a man named Howie Winter, the leader of the Winter Hill Gang, a crew based out of Somerville that controlled organized crime across the Boston area. Winter Hill wasn't your typical street gang. They were organized, disciplined, and deeply connected. They had structure. They had reach. Whitey joined up, and it didn't take long for him to rise through the ranks. By the mid-1970s, he was one of the gang's top earners, running loan sharking, gambling, extortion, and drug operations across South Boston. Money was flowing in, and Whitey was smart enough to know how to keep it moving. In 1974, Whitey formed a partnership with a man named Stephen the Rifleman Flemmy, a fellow gangster with ties to both the Winter Hill Gang and the New England Mafia. Together, they built a criminal empire that would last for decades. They controlled bookmakers, extorted business owners, ran drug operations, and eliminated anyone who got in their way. The two men were brutal, calculated, and efficient. And they shared one more thing in common. They were both about to become FBI informants. But the move that changed everything didn't happen on the streets. It happened in a back room with a badge. And once that door opened, there was no closing it. In 1975, Whitey Bulger made a deal with the FBI. He became an informant, officially registered as a top echelon informant, which meant he was feeding information to the feds in exchange for protection. His handler was a man named John Connolly, an FBI agent who just happened to grow up in the same Southie projects as Whitey. They knew each other from childhood. Connolly idolized Whitey's older brother, Billy, who by then was a powerful Massachusetts state senator. That personal connection turned into a criminal conspiracy that would last for decades. The deal was simple on paper. Whitey would give the FBI information on the Italian Mafia, specifically the Patriarch of Crime family, which controlled much of New England's organized crime. In return, the FBI would look the other way while Whitey ran his own operation. But the reality was way darker. Connolly didn't just protect Whitey, he became his partner. He tipped him off about investigations, warned him when informants were talking, and even helped eliminate Whitey's competition by feeding the feds false information about rival gangsters. That word partner keeps showing up because that's what it was. Connolly wasn't some rogue agent bending the rules, he was all in. He took cash payments, he fed Whitey intelligence, and he made sure the Boston FBI field office kept Whitey's name out of every major case. It was corruption at the highest level, and nobody was checking it. With the FBI in his pocket, Whitey became untouchable. He took over the Winter Hill Gang after Howie Winter got arrested on federal charges in 1979, and from that point on, Whitey ran Boston. He controlled the rackets, the drug trade, the bookmaking, the extortion. If you wanted to do business in Southie or Somerville, you paid Whitey. If you crossed him, you disappeared. Simple as that. And people did disappear, a lot of people. Whitey wasn't just a gangster, he was a predator. He ruled through fear, violence, and a cold, calculated cruelty that made even hardened criminals uncomfortable. He didn't just kill his enemies, he made examples out of them. Some were strangled, others were shot in the back of the head, a few were buried in unmarked graves, their families never knowing what happened. That's what made Whitey different. He didn't kill in rage, he killed with purpose. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Whitey and Flemmy committed murder after murder, and the FBI let it happen. In 1975, they sprayed a phone booth with bullets, killing a bar owner named Edward Connors because he was talking about Winter Hill business. Flemmy later testified that another gang member lured Connors to the phone booth, telling him he'd receive a call at a certain time. When Connors showed up, Whitey and Flemmy were waiting. They stepped out from the side of a building and opened fire with everything they had. Flemmy said Whitey emptied a double-barreled shotgun and a pistol, while Flemmy fired 7 or 8 shots. Connors didn't stand a chance. He was dead before he hit the ground. But one of the most brutal chapters in Whitey's reign came in 1981, when the Winter Hill Gang got involved in a gambling business called World Jai Alai. The company was run by a businessman named Roger Wheeler, who had started noticing that money was being skimmed from the operation. John Callahan, a corrupt accountant and Whitey's associate, had been stealing from the company, and when Wheeler threatened to expose him, Whitey decided Wheeler had to die. This wasn't a street beef, this was business. And in Whitey's world, business problems got solved permanently. Whitey and Flemmy put together a murder kit, guns, ammunition, disguises, and sent it on a bus to Oklahoma, where Wheeler lived. John Martirano picked up the package and spent 4 days tracking Wheeler's movements. He followed him to work, to lunch, to the golf course. He studied his routine like a professional. On May 27, 1981, Martirano waited in the parking lot of Southern Hills Country Club. When Wheeler walked to his car after a round of golf, Martirano yanked open the door, put a .357 Magnum to the bridge of Wheeler's nose, and fired a single shot, killing him instantly. Then he calmly walked away, got in his car, and drove back to Boston like nothing happened. But Wheeler's murder created a problem. A man named Brian Halloran knew too much. Halloran was a low-level criminal who'd been approached by Whitey and Flemmy to kill Wheeler, but had turned them down. After the murder, Halloran started talking to the FBI, offering to testify against Whitey in exchange for witness protection. John Connolly, Whitey's FBI handler, immediately tipped him off. Whitey decided Halloran had to go. No hesitation, no second thoughts. On May 11, 1982, Halloran was having drinks at a bar on Northern Avenue in South Boston. Whitey's enforcer, Kevin Weeks, staked out the location and radioed Whitey when Halloran left. A friend of Halloran's, Michael Donahue, offered him a ride home. Donahue was a truck driver, a family man with 3 kids, and had nothing to do with the underworld. He was just being a good neighbor, offering a ride to someone who'd had too much to drink. As Donahue's blue Datsun pulled out of the parking lot, Whitey opened fire. He emptied a carbine rifle into the car, hitting both men multiple times. Donahue was killed instantly, slumped over the wheel, blood pouring from his chest. Halloran stumbled out of the car, bleeding, trying to crawl away, and Whitey kept shooting until Halloran collapsed on the pavement. Weeks later testified that Whitey just kept shooting even after Halloran hit the ground, like he wanted to make sure there was no coming back from this. Then Weeks calmly drove away, circled back to pick up a hubcap that had fallen off during the shooting, and went to get something to eat because he was hungry. That's how cold it was. Murder, then a sandwich. John Callahan, the man who'd set up the Wheeler murder, became the next target. In August 1982, Connolly warned Whitey that the FBI was going to question Callahan about Wheeler's death. Whitey and Flemmy decided Callahan couldn't be trusted. He knew too much, and pressure makes people crack. Martirano, who considered Callahan a close friend, was told to handle it. Martirano lured Callahan to Florida under the pretense of a meeting about a new business deal, then shot him in the head inside a car at Fort Lauderdale International Airport. They left his body in the trunk of a leased Cadillac at Miami International Airport. When the body was discovered 3 days later, blood was dripping from the trunk onto the pavement, and the smell had already started to draw flies. But Whitey's violence wasn't limited to rival gangsters and snitches. He also killed women, something even his defense attorneys struggled to explain. One of his most horrific murders involved a woman named Deborah Davis, the girlfriend of his partner, Stephen Flemmy. Davis had been with Flemmy for over 7 years, but in 1981, during an argument, Flemmy accidentally let it slip that he and Whitey were FBI informants. Whitey was furious. He told Flemmi that Davis knew too much and had to be killed. No discussion. No alternatives. On September 17, 1981, Flemmi brought Davis to a house his mother owned in South Boston. When they walked inside, Whitey came out from a side room and began strangling her. Davis fought back, scratching, kicking, trying to scream, but Whitey didn't stop. He dragged her to the basement where she died. Flemmi later testified that he watched the entire thing happen, that he stood there and let his girlfriend die because Whitey said it had to be done. Afterward, they pulled out her teeth with pliers and cut off her fingertips with a knife to make identification harder, then buried her body near the Neponset River in Quincy. Davis was 26 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her, and Whitey took it because she knew a secret. One of the most brutal murders came in 1984 when Whitey killed a man named John McIntyre, a fisherman who'd gotten involved in a scheme to smuggle weapons to the Irish Republican Army. When the FBI started investigating, McIntyre cooperated, thinking he could cut a deal. Connolly once again tipped off Whitey. In November 1984, Whitey lured McIntyre to a house in South Boston under the pretense of a meeting to smooth things over. Once McIntyre arrived, they tied him to a chair and interrogated him for hours, asking him what he told the feds, who else knew, whether he testified yet. Whitey personally strangled him with a rope, pulling it tight around his neck. When McIntyre didn't die fast enough, when he kept gasping and choking, Whitey shot him in the head. His body wasn't found for nearly 20 years. Through all of this, the murders, the extortion, the drugs, the terror, the FBI did nothing. In fact, they enabled it. John Connolly made sure Whitey's name was kept out of investigations. When state police or Boston PD tried to build cases against Whitey, Connolly would shut them down, claiming Whitey was too valuable as an informant. When other criminals tried to cooperate with authorities and mention Whitey's name, they'd end up dead within days because Connolly would tip Whitey off. Flemmi later testified that the gang paid Connolly over $230,000 in cash over a 15-year period. In 1983 alone, Connolly received 2 payments of $25,000 each. After the second payment, Flemmi said, Connolly remarked with a smile, "I'm one of the gang," and he meant it. By the early 1990s, other law enforcement agencies were getting suspicious. The Massachusetts State Police and the Drug Enforcement Administration couldn't understand why every investigation into Whitey Bulger seemed to fall apart. Informants would go silent, witnesses would disappear, evidence would vanish, files would get lost. Something wasn't right, and the deeper they dug, the more it smelled like corruption. In 1994, a federal indictment was finally coming down, and this time even Connolly couldn't stop it. The DEA had built a case that the FBI couldn't bury, but Connolly did the next best thing. He warned Whitey. On December 23, 1994, just days before Christmas, John Connolly tipped off Whitey that an arrest warrant was about to be issued. Whitey didn't hesitate. He grabbed his longtime girlfriend, Teresa Stanley, packed a bag with cash and fake IDs, and disappeared into the night. For the next 16 years, James Whitey Bulger became one of the most wanted fugitives in America. He was placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, right alongside Osama bin Laden and other international terrorists. The FBI offered a $2 million reward for information leading to his capture. But Whitey stayed gone, and he stayed smart. Whitey first fled with Teresa Stanley, his girlfriend since the late 1960s. They traveled to New Orleans for New Year's, then drove to Arizona and California, staying in cheap motels and keeping their heads down. But Stanley missed her family in Boston and couldn't handle life on the run. She wanted to go home. In early 1995, Whitey drove her back to Boston, dropped her off in a parking lot without a word, and picked up his other girlfriend, Catherine Grigg, who had been his mistress for years. Catherine Grigg was 22 years younger than Whitey, a quiet woman who'd been devoted to him since the 1980s. For 16 years, Whitey and Catherine moved across the country and even traveled internationally. They used fake IDs under the names Charlie and Carol Gasco. They stayed in cheap motels and apartments, avoided cameras, and kept to themselves. Whitey dyed his hair, grew a beard, wore glasses, and transformed his appearance. He was disciplined, paranoid, and always one step ahead. He never used the same phone twice. He never stayed in one place too long. He watched every car that passed, every person who looked twice. They lived in Louisiana, stayed in Wyoming, spent time in Chicago, and even traveled to Europe. Investigators later confirmed they had visited places like Sicily and Dublin, probably using fake passports. But eventually, Whitey settled in Santa Monica, California, living in a modest apartment under the name Charlie Gasco. He and Catherine lived a quiet, almost invisible life. They walked the beach in the mornings, fed stray cats in the afternoons, and kept to themselves. Neighbors knew them as a nice older couple who didn't cause trouble. Nobody suspected a thing. Whitey was cautious with money. His net worth was estimated at around $50 million before he fled, but he was careful not to draw attention. At the time of his arrest, investigators found $822,000 in cash hidden in the walls of his Santa Monica apartment. The money consisted almost exclusively of $100 bills dated to 1995. Whitey worried that the outdated bills might draw suspicion if he tried to spend them, so he'd regularly take large amounts of cash to Las Vegas, trade it for casino chips, gamble a few hands of blackjack, then cash out the chips for newer, untraceable bills. It was smart, methodical, the kind of thinking that kept him free for 16 years. But in 2011, the FBI launched a new media campaign, and this time they changed their strategy. Instead of focusing on Whitey, they focused on Catherine Gregg. They plastered her face on billboards and ran ads targeting women who might have seen her at beauty salons or dental offices. They obtained new photographs of her from a plastic surgeon's office she'd visited years earlier. The strategy worked. A tip came in from a former neighbor in Iceland who recognized her, and then another from Santa Monica. On June 22nd, 2011, FBI agents surrounded the apartment building on 3rd Street in Santa Monica. The building manager, working with the FBI, lured Whitey out of his apartment under the false pretense of a maintenance issue in the parking garage. When Whitey stepped out, agents moved in fast. Whitey surrendered without a fight, raising his hands slowly, probably knowing it was finally over. Inside the apartment, agents found the cash, along with a stockpile of weapons, fake IDs, and disguises. The 16-year manhunt was over. Whitey was 81 years old, and he was going back to Boston to face everything he'd run from. Whitey was extradited back to Boston to face trial. The charges were staggering: 19 counts of murder, along with racketeering, extortion, money laundering, and weapons violations. The trial began in June 2013, and it was one of the most explosive court cases in Boston's history. Prosecutors laid out decades of violence, corruption, and betrayal. Over 72 witnesses testified during the 2-month trial. Among the witnesses were Whitey's former associates, the men who'd killed alongside him. John Martirano, the hitman who carried out 20 murders on Whitey's orders, took the stand and described the killings in chilling detail. He spoke calmly, almost casually, like he was describing a fishing trip. Kevin Weeks, Whitey's enforcer, testified about the murders he'd witnessed, including the killing of Michael Donahue. And Stephen Flemmi, Whitey's partner for decades, provided the most damaging testimony, describing how Whitey strangled Deborah Davis and Deborah Hussey while Flemmi watched and did nothing. Whitey's defense team tried to argue that he had immunity, that his deal with the FBI meant he couldn't be prosecuted, but the judge shut that down immediately. There was no immunity for murder. The evidence was overwhelming. The bodies, the testimony, the FBI files, it all pointed to one man. On August 12, 2013, the jury found Whitey Bulger guilty on 31 of 32 counts, including involvement in 11 murders. 2 months later, on November 14, 2013, Judge Denise Casper sentenced Whitey to 2 consecutive life terms plus 5 years. She called his crimes unfathomable and said his actions had destroyed countless lives. Whitey was 84 years old. He would never see freedom again. But even behind bars, Whitey's name still carried weight. He moved through the federal prison system, first in Arizona, then transferred to a facility in Florida. He kept to himself mostly, didn't talk much, but other inmates knew who he was. In October 2018, he was transferred from a Florida prison to USP Hazelton, a high-security federal prison in West Virginia. The move was controversial. Hazelton had a reputation for violence, understaffing, and poor supervision. And Whitey was old, frail, and had a history of cooperating with law enforcement, which made him a target in any prison. On October 30th, 2018, just hours after arriving at Hazelton, Whitey was killed. 3 inmates attacked him in his cell, beating him so viciously that his eyes were nearly dislodged from his skull. They used a padlock stuffed inside a sock, swinging it over and over until his face was unrecognizable. He was found the next morning, wrapped in a blanket, his face destroyed, blood soaked into the concrete. He was 89 years old. 2 of the inmates were later charged with his murder, including a Massachusetts mobster named Freddie Gaius, who reportedly hated informants and had ties to organized crime families that Whitey had helped the FBI take down. Some say it was revenge, others say it was just prison justice. Either way, Whitey died the way he'd lived, in violence. The fallout from Whitey's life didn't end with his death. John Connolly, the FBI agent who protected him for decades, was convicted of racketeering and second-degree murder for his role in tipping off Whitey about John Callahan, which led directly to Callahan's murder. The FBI was forced to reckon with one of the biggest corruption scandals in its history. So what do you call a man who killed without remorse, who worked with the FBI while running one of the most violent criminal enterprises in American history, who evaded justice for 16 years and died the same way he lived? That's the question Boston had to face when Whitey Bulger's story finally ended. But Whitey Bulger didn't build his empire alone. He had help, and that help came with a badge.